Have you ever wondered how something built over 2,000 years ago still stands firm, defying time, earthquakes, wars, and oblivion? Among the many ruins left behind by history, there is a wall, a silent wall, that seems to endure not only because of the stone, but because of the faith placed within it. The Western Wall in Jerusalem is one of the most enigmatic places in the world. It is the last vestige of the Second Temple of Solomon, destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 AD. But the mystery surrounding its construction and permanence goes far beyond religion. How could something so grand have been erected without machines, without cranes, without the aid of modern technology? Some of the stone blocks used there weigh more than 500 tons, the equivalent of more than 300 cars put together, and yet they were cut, transported, and fitted together with a precision that engineers today are still trying to comprehend. Can you imagine how many secrets are hidden behind each of these stones? Biblical and archaeological records indicate that the wall began to be built during the reign of Herod the Great, a king known as much for his genius as for his tyranny. Herod wanted to leave an eternal mark, a monument that would make him remembered long after his name was forgotten on the thrones. But some say that what he erected in the name of faith was also a way of defying God himself, because behind the scenes of the temple, in the corridors of power and faith, there was more than prayers. There was politics, ambition, and fear. The Wailing Wall, also called the Western Wall, is the most sacred remaining part of the ancient temple. According to ancient traditions, it is the point where heaven meets earth, where the divine presence was closest to humankind, and it is there at that exact spot that for centuries people of all backgrounds have come to weep, pray, and leave their requests among the cracks in the stones. What many don't know is that more than half of this wall is buried, hidden beneath layers of earth and time. The visible part is only the surface of an invisible colossus, a foundation so deep that not even earthquakes have managed to shake it. But what no one has ever been able to explain is why it never fell. Earthquakes devastated Jerusalem. Entire armies tried to erase its traces. The temple was destroyed, the people were exiled, but the wall remained. To this day, archaeologists, engineers, and scholars seek to understand how a monument from that era could have remained intact. Some speak of advanced engineering, others of luck, and there are those who believe that the secret lies in something much deeper, in a spiritual energy, something invisible that holds those stones together. Perhaps the Wailing Wall was more than just a physical construction. Perhaps it was an attempt to capture eternity in stone. Each block seems to carry echoes of ancient voices, prayers left for centuries, tears that time could not erase. If you get close enough, you can feel that it breathes, that it pulsates, that there is something alive there, something that has survived everything. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may change the way you see not only the history of faith, but the very power of human persistence. Because understanding how the Western Wall was built is to unravel not just an engineering feat, but a mystery that unites the earthly and the divine, a secret that somehow still endures, stone upon stone to this day. Before we continue, leave a like. It really helps the channel to keep unearthing stories that almost no one dares to tell. And if you feel that this type of content speaks to your soul, subscribe too. That way, with each new video, you'll be here with me, revealing together the secrets that time has tried to hide. Let's talk now about a man obsessed with eternity, Herod the Great. You've probably heard of him as the cruel king who tried to kill Jesus as a child. But the true story of this man is much more complex, much darker, and believe me, much more fascinating. Herod was not a pure-blooded Jewish king. He was an Idumean, a foreigner, considered by many to be a usurper, occupying a throne that did not belong to him, and he knew it. He felt the weight of this rejection every day, so he decided to do something grand, something that would force the people to recognize him, something that would inscribe his name in history forever. He didn't build the Wailing Wall out of pure devotion. He built it out of vanity for power, out of a visceral need to prove his worth to both Rome and Israel. Herod's decision to expand the Second Temple did not come from divine revelation or a prophetic calling. It stemmed from a calculating and political mindset. He observed the great Roman emperors erecting amphitheaters, aqueducts, and palaces that defied the heavens. And he thought, why can't I, King of Jerusalem, do the same? But Herod was shrewd. He knew he couldn't simply build a Roman arena in the heart of Israel. That would be seen as blasphemy. So he found the perfect loophole, transforming the Temple of Jerusalem into the most impressive structure in the Middle East. Thus, he would please the Romans with its grandeur and win over the Jews with a seemingly pious act. It was political genius disguised as faith. But here's the hidden truth that few reveal. Herod had a problem. The original Temple Mount was too small for his ambition. So instead of simply renovating the existing sanctuary, he made a bold and transformative decision. He would expand the mountain itself. Yes, you heard right. Herod decided to artificially expand the Temple Mount, creating a colossal platform supported by monumental retaining walls. And that's exactly where our Western Wall comes in. It wasn't part of the sacred temple itself. It was the foundation, the invisible base, the raw support that held all that religious glory aloft. The irony is devastating. What remained was not the gold, not the divine altars, but precisely what Herod built as a mere foundation. The construction process was brutal. Herod hired 10,000 workers, many of them slaves and prisoners of war. He trained 1,000 priests as stonemasons so they could work in the most sacred areas without desecrating them. The stones he had quarried and transported were monstrous, some weighing over 500 tons. Think about that for a moment. Stone blocks larger than modern airplanes being dragged, fitted together perfectly without mortar, forming a structure so solid it would withstand earthquakes, invasions, and 2,000 years of history. The impact of this work was physical, but also psychological. When people looked at those gigantic walls, they didn't just see architecture, they saw absolute power materialized in stone. But behind this show of force, something more sinister was happening behind the scenes. Herod was paranoid, violent, and deeply insecure. He killed his own wife, his children, anyone who threatened his control, and while building the ultimate symbol of Jewish faith, he also erected luxurious palaces, Roman amphitheaters, and even pagan temples in other cities. Herod lived in permanent contradiction, trying to please everyone while trusting no one, and this duality is literally carved into the stones he left behind. Now comes the part that challenges everything you think you know about the ancient world. Because when modern archaeologists, armed with all the technology of the 21st century, stand before the Western Wall and try to explain how it was built, they simply can't make it work. The heaviest stones of the wall weigh over 500 tons. To give you an idea of what that means, it's the equivalent of almost 400 cars stacked on a single block of rock. And we're not talking about stones thrown haphazardly. We're talking about blocks cut with surgical precision, perfectly fitted, together, without a single gram of mortar or cement between them. Can you imagine the mindset required to plan something like that? The audacity to look at a mountain of stone and decide to transform it into the foundation of something eternal. But here's the mystery that no one can fully solve. How did they move these monstrosities? There were no cranes, no explosives to facilitate cutting, no trucks or hydraulic machines. There were only men, ropes, rudimentary levers, and almost insane determination. The most accepted theories speak of gigantic earthen ramps built around the structure, allowing thousands of workers to slowly drag the blocks up the mountain. Others suggest the use of wooden sleds lubricated with water or oil, roller systems made from tree trunks, even rhythmic swinging techniques where dozens of men pushed in sync to the sound of drums. But even with all these explanations, something doesn't add up, because the hidden truth is that no one has successfully replicated these feats using only the technology of the time. There's something almost supernatural about the perfection of those stones. When you run your hand along the joints between the blocks, you can barely fit a sheet of paper in them. There are no gaps, no flaws. And this after 2,000 years of earthquakes, wars, invasions, and natural wear and tear. The journey of each of these stones began in King Solomon's quarries, located miles from Jerusalem. There, specialized teams identified the suitable rocks, marked the cutting points, and began the brutal work of separating tons of limestone from the mountain using only bronze and iron chisels, wooden wedges that were soaked with water to expand and crack the rock. It was a process that could take months for a single block. Then came the transport, which is where things got truly absurd. Imagine hundreds of men pulling ropes tied to a house-sized rock, advancing centimeters per hour under the scorching desert sun. Many died crushed when the ropes snapped or when the blocks slipped off the ramps. Many others simply collapsed from exhaustion. But these deaths were not recorded, not mourned, because for the organizers of that colossal project, human lives were just another resource to be consumed. The human impact of this construction was devastating, but it was systematically erased from official records. What remained was only the glory of the stone, not the pain of those who carried it. And there's another disturbing detail that few mention. Some of the largest stones of the wall are at the base, buried deep in the ground. This means that Herod wasn't content with just what was visible. He wanted the foundation to be equally monumental, even knowing that no one would ever see those lower layers. It was vanity elevated to obsessive perfection, or was there another reason? Some historians suggest that these deep foundations were planned to withstand not only time, but specific forces, as if Herod anticipated invasions, sieges, and attempts at demolition, as if he knew that one day everything would be tested to the limit. But wait, because the story gets even more intense when you discover where these stones came from and what happened even before they arrived at the wall. The quarries of Jerusalem were not just places of manual labor, they were considered sacred, almost mystical places. A profound transformation took place there, something that went far beyond the physical cutting of the rock. The workers did not see those stones as simple building material. For them, each block extracted from the mountain carried a divine mission, a purpose that transcended the material world. Before starting the day's work, before lifting the first hammer, the men knelt and prayed. They asked permission from the earth, they asked strength from the heavens, they asked that their hands be guided so as not to profane what would be part of the holy temple. This mentality created an almost ritualistic atmosphere in the quarries. It wasn't just sweat and blood. It was devotion materialized in every stroke of the chisel. The supervisors, many of them priests specially trained for this role, inspected each stone with obsessive care. If there was any imperfection, any crack or flaw in the cut, that rock was rejected immediately. There could be no mistake, no carelessness, because in their view, those stones would not only be the physical foundation of the temple, they would be solidified faith, prayers transformed into matter, the very divine will manifested in the limestone and stone of Jerusalem. And here's something that will give you goosebumps. When a stone was finally approved and ready to be transported to the Temple Mount, a ceremony took place. The workers gathered around that gigantic block, touched it with their hands, whispered prayers, and, according to some ancient accounts, even poured consecrated oil over its surface. It was as if they were baptizing that rock, preparing it spiritually for the journey ahead and the eternal destiny that awaited it. Think about the intensity of that. Think about the psychological impact of believing that you are not just moving stones, but literally building God's house on earth. But there's a darker side to this whole story, because not everyone who worked there did so out of devotion. Many were prisoners of war, slaves captured in battles against neighboring peoples, men and women torn from their lands and forced to erect a temple to a god who was not their own. Imagine the cruel irony of this situation. Their hands bleeding as they carried sacred stones, their strength being consumed to build the glory of a faith they didn't share, perhaps even detested. These workers didn't pray out of devotion. They prayed for survival, for one less day of torment, for a quick death if fate so decided. And behind the scenes, far from the eyes of the priests and official records, strange stories circulated. Whispers about men who went mad in the quarries, who began to hear voices coming from the rocks, who swore they saw shadows moving among the cut blocks. Some believed that the stones absorbed not only prayers, but also the suffering, the anger, the despair of all who touched them, that each block of the wall carried invisible memories, echoes of muffled screams and ignored pleas. Such revelations never reached the sacred texts, but survived in legends passed down from generation to generation among the workers' families. What you see when you look at the Western Wall is merely an illusion of completeness, because the truth is that more than half of this monumental structure has never been seen by most people who visit it. I'm talking about entire layers of gigantic stones buried deep beneath the soil of Jerusalem, hidden in the bowels of the earth, forming a foundation so massive that it defies any attempt at destruction. This is the hidden truth that completely changes how you see this place. The wall you see on the surface is only the beginning of something much larger, much older, and much more resilient than any invader could ever have imagined. Consider the strategic decision behind it. Herod and his architects knew exactly what they were doing when they buried those colossal stones meters and meters below ground level. It wasn't just a matter of structural stability, it was a mindset of eternity. It was about building something that couldn't be torn down, not even with all the military might in the world. And look at the dark genius of that choice. While the invaders focused on destroying what was visible, on tearing down the sky-high walls, on burning the golden altars and looting the temple's treasures, they could never reach the base. The foundation remained untouched, invincible, silent beneath the rubble. Modern archaeologists only discovered the true extent of these subterranean layers when they began excavations in the 20th century. And when they descended, when they illuminated those dark and narrow galleries beneath Jerusalem's Muslim quarter, what they found was breathtaking. 17 additional layers of stone, some so deep that they reach almost 20 meters below the current surface of the city. It's like discovering that the tip of an iceberg hides a submerged mountain, and in these tunnels, in these hidden passages that snake along the base of the wall, you can touch stones that no invader has managed to desecrate, that no earthquake has managed to displace, that carry 2,000 years of history preserved in darkness. There is something profoundly symbolic in all of this. What remained was not the visible glory, not the gleaming gold, not the exuberant decoration of the temple. What survived was precisely what no one saw, what was hidden, what was considered mere support. And isn't that exactly how it works with stories that have been erased? The female voices that shaped that place, the anonymous workers who bled for it, the forbidden rituals that took place behind the scenes, all of this was pushed beneath the official surface of history, but it remains there, buried, waiting to be discovered by those who have the courage to dig. These revelations about the wall's subterranean structure also explain why it withstood such brutal invasions. When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in the year 70 AD, they weren't playing around. They burned everything, systematically demolishing every wall, every tower, every gate. The historian Flavius Josephus described the destruction as so complete that a future visitor would not be able to believe that a city had ever existed there. But they couldn't tear up the foundation. They simply didn't have the technology or time to excavate dozens of meters and dismantle 500-ton blocks buried under layers of earth and rock. There is a profound, almost inexplicable belief that permeates every inch of those ancient stones. For those who approach the Western Wall with true faith, it is not just a historical wall, it is literally the closest point a human being can get to the divine presence on earth. We are talking about the last visible fragment of what was once the Holy of Holies, the most sacred chamber of the temple, where according to tradition only the high priest could enter, only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. Inside, they said, dwelt the very essence of God, and when everything was destroyed, when the gold melted and the walls crumbled, what remained was precisely this retaining wall, as if the divinity had chosen to preserve a portal, a connection, a final link between heaven and earth. But what makes this place truly disturbing is the belief that the wall has a life of its own. Have you ever stopped to think about what that means? Millions of people over 2,000 years approaching those stones, touching their worn surface, whispering prayers, shedding tears, slipping pieces of paper with supplications into the gaps between the blocks. And there is an absolute conviction among the devotees that these prayers are not lost, do not disappear, are not carried away by the wind. They are absorbed, as if each stone were a spiritual sponge that captures and preserves every word, every hope, every despair deposited there. Think about the psychological transformation this brings about. When you believe that your words will be eternally preserved by a structure that has witnessed empires rise and fall, that has survived apocalyptic destruction, that has stood firm while everything around it disintegrated, your prayers take on a different weight. It's no longer just speaking into the void, hoping to be heard. It's trusting that there is something in those stones, an ancient memory, a silent consciousness that records and preserves everything. Some call it faith, others call it madness. But when you see people of all ages, from all corners of the world, touching that wall with absolute reverence, it's impossible not to feel that something deeper is happening there. Scientists have studied the phenomenon of the papers left in the cracks of the wall. There are millions of them, written in dozens of languages, asking for healing, love, forgiveness, and justice. Some rabbis have the job of periodically collecting these papers to prevent the wall from becoming saturated, and they are buried in Jewish cemeteries because they are considered too sacred to simply be discarded. But many believe that even when the papers are physically removed, the essence of the prayers remains impregnated in the rock, as if there were an invisible layer of prayers accumulated over the centuries, forming an aura of suffering, hope, and faith so dense that you can almost physically feel it when you approach. And there's another strange detail that few mention. There are accounts of people who swore they heard whispers when they put their ear to the wall in moments of absolute silence. Not clear words, but indistinct murmurs, like echoes of all the prayers ever uttered there, overlapping in a spiritual cacophony. Some say it's just the wind passing through the ancient cracks. Others believe it's the wall itself returning fragments of the supplications it absorbed. There's something deeply unsettling when you begin to trace the journey of all those who have tried to destroy the wall throughout the centuries, because it wasn't for lack of trying that it still stands. Entire empires, armies with thousands of soldiers, leaders obsessed with erasing any trace of Jewish history, all passed through Jerusalem with the same ambition, to reduce those stones to dust. But something always went wrong, and the more you investigate the behind-the-scenes aspects of these attempts, the more bizarre it becomes. We're talking about absurd coincidences, inexplicable deaths, irrational decisions by veteran generals who suddenly changed their minds at the last moment, as if an invisible force protected those stones from any definitive violation. When the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70, they had clear orders from Emperor Titus: leave no stone unturned. It was a brutal political message. Jerusalem and everything it represented needed to be erased from human memory, and they almost succeeded. They burned the temple with such ferocity that molten gold seeped into the cracks of the stones, and soldiers ripped away blocks to extract the precious metal. But when they reached the retaining wall, something changed. Some historians say that Titus simply decided to leave it standing as a reminder of what Rome was capable of destroying. But there are darker accounts, lost documents that speak of soldiers who refused to touch certain sections, who said they heard menacing voices, who claimed to feel an oppressive presence whenever they tried to remove the blocks from the base. Centuries later, during the Crusades, when Jerusalem changed hands between Christians and Muslims with unprecedented violence, the wall remained untouched. There was even a Muslim leader who, according to urban legends preserved by Jewish communities, ordered the wall to be completely demolished to build a mosque on the site. But the night before the work began, he had a disturbing dream. He dreamt of a figure of light who warned him, if a single stone of that wall were removed, his dynasty would end in bloodshed. The man awoke terrified and immediately cancelled the order. Coincidence? Superstition? Or was there something more happening behind the scenes of the official story? There are even documented cases of modern engineers who planned urban reforms in the wall region and mysteriously abandoned or died before completing the projects. During the British Mandate period in Palestine, in the early 20th century, British architects proposed tearing down part of the wall to widen a street. The chief engineer responsible for the project suffered a sudden mental breakdown and spent the rest of his life in an asylum, murmuring about living stones and divine punishment. The project was abandoned without official explanation. These revelations rarely appear in history books, but survive in obscure archives and testimonies from families who lost loved ones in strange circumstances linked to the wall. The psychological impact of these stories over time created an almost mythical aura of protection around the place. Even rulers who didn't believe in anything supernatural hesitated before giving orders that involved significant alterations to the wall. It was as if there was a collective mentality, an ancestral memory, that tampering with those stones brought consequences that no army could face. Comment below. This gives me chills. If you also feel that something inexplicable has been protecting this place for centuries. After the flames consumed the temple and the Romans scattered the Jewish people to the four corners of the world, something devastating happened. It wasn't just the loss of a sacred building, it was the shattering of an entire identity. Imagine having your spiritual home, the only place on earth where you believed God physically dwelt, reduced to ashes and rubble, and then being forced to leave, not knowing if you would ever return, carrying only memories of a place that might never exist again. That was the journey of an entire people. Decades turned into centuries. Generations were born and died in exile, hearing stories about the temple from their grandparents, but never seeing it with their own eyes. It was like carrying the longing for something you never knew, but that somehow lived within you. When, centuries later, groups of Jews finally managed to return to Jerusalem, they didn't know exactly what they would find. The city had changed hands countless times, been rebuilt under the rule of different empires, its streets redesigned, its landmarks erased. But when they arrived at the temple, Mountain saw that wall still standing, those massive stones stubbornly resisting time and destruction. Something broke within them. It wasn't just recognition, it was like finding a relative you thought was dead. And there, before those ancient rocks, they began to weep. It wasn't weeping of pure despair. It was a devastating mixture of grief for the loss, relief at finding at least a fragment of what had been lost, and a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a connection to that glorious past. This collective emotional transformation was so profound that it completely changed the meaning of that place. The wall ceased to be merely an architectural structure and became an altar of lamentation, an open-air confessional, a repository of all the pain accumulated over generations. People began to go there not only to pray, but to vent, to scream their anguish, to let their tears flow over the stones like liquid offerings. And thus was born the name that persists to this day, the Wailing Wall. It was not an official title given by religious authorities, it was simply what the people came to call it, because that is what happened there, pure and raw lamentation. But there is a more complex side to this narrative that is rarely explored, because not all the tears shed there over the centuries were those of Jews mourning the lost temple. Women of all eras, of all backgrounds, also found in that wall a place to deposit their own secret sorrows. Abandoned wives, mothers who lost children, women unjustly accused, sex slaves from nearby harems who escaped for a few moments, all of them, at some point in history, touched those stones and left their own lamentations, their own pleas, silenced by a society that did not listen to them. The impact of this invisible female presence shaped the place as much as the official prayers of the men. And there's something disturbing about all this. The wall became a symbol of resistance precisely because it witnessed destruction. It represents not what was preserved intact, but what remained after everything collapsed. It's the scar that proves there was a wound. It's the physical memory of the catastrophe, and perhaps that's exactly why so many people identify with it so viscerally. So you might be thinking, okay, the stories are fascinating, but there's a rational explanation for all this, right? And that's exactly where things get even more intriguing. Because when modern engineers, armed with cutting-edge technology and decades of knowledge about ancient structures, began to study the Western Wall scientifically, they discovered something that completely defied their expectations. Those stones aren't just piled up haphazardly. There's such a sophisticated logic behind the construction that it seems impossible it could have been conceived 2,000 years ago without the resources and understanding we have today. It's as if Herod's architects had access to knowledge that simply shouldn't have existed back then. Let's start with the lower blocks. They were made with extremely dense limestone, extracted from deep layers of the quarries. And here's the ingenious part. This specific type of limestone has a natural property of absorbing moisture from the soil. When this happens, the stone expands microscopically, creating pressure that actually reinforces the structure instead of weakening it. It's as if the wall self-heals, constantly adjusting to environmental conditions. Think about the mindset required to understand this. Without microscopes, without laboratory tests, without anything but empirical observation over years, how did they discover that this specific type of rock would react in this way over time? But it doesn't stop there. The upper layers of the wall were built with progressively lighter and more porous stones. This wasn't a matter of saving effort or chance. It was a deliberate and calculated decision. These upper stones act as natural energy, dissipators. When violent winds or seismic tremors hit the wall, the upper layers absorb and disperse the impact, preventing the force from concentrating on a single point and causing catastrophic cracks. It's the same principle used in modern skyscrapers that have damping systems to withstand earthquakes, except this was done in the 1st century BC. Experts also discovered that the wall's angle of inclination isn't perfectly vertical. There's a subtle, almost imperceptible tilt to the naked eye that distributes weight more efficiently and dramatically increases stability. And the spacing between the stone joints, which appears random at first glance, actually follows a complex mathematical pattern that avoids continuous lines of weakness. If you tried to knock down the wall by applying force at one point, the structure would redistribute that impact across the entire surface, making it virtually impossible to cause significant damage. There's something almost unsettling about realizing that these revelations came from analyses using equipment that didn't exist until a few decades ago. What else is hidden in that structure that we don't yet have the technology to detect? Some engineers have suggested that there may be internal cavities in the larger stones, reducing the actual weight without compromising strength, a technique that was only invented in modern architecture centuries later. But how can we confirm this without drilling into stones considered too sacred to be violated? And here's the unsettling truth. The more science studies the wall, the more questions arise, because for every logical explanation found, 3 new mysteries emerge about how that knowledge was acquired and applied with such precision at a time when most of humanity was still struggling with basic constructions. Comment below. Science doesn't explain everything. If you feel there's more to this story than just engineering. Each stone of the Western Wall carries more than just marks. Of time, it carries voices. Ancient murmurs echo between the cracks in the rocks, as if the wind itself recited the prayers of thousands of souls who have passed through there. Some say that if you approach in silence, you can hear the sound of promises that were never fulfilled. Others believe that the wall is not just a vestige of the past, but a spiritual portal, a point where heaven and earth almost touch, and perhaps that is the true reason for its survival. It was built with faith, but also with suffering, hope, and regret. Excavations around Jerusalem reveal something even more fascinating. Beneath the foundations of the wall, there are ancient tunnels and chambers that appear to have been built to protect not only the temple, but the very memory of a people. Imagine what it was like to live in a time when every stone had to be laid at the risk of death, amidst Roman invasion, persecution, and fear. Even so, those men continued stacking gigantic blocks, polishing every detail as if they were building something that could never be forgotten. And it wasn't. Modern archaeologists, fascinated by the wall's perfection, still wonder how it remains intact after more than 2 millennia. No current technology could reproduce the precise fit of its stones, some weighing tons, cut so exactly that not even a knife blade can pass between them. How did a people, with rudimentary tools, manage to create something so resistant? Was it chance? A miracle? Or was there ancient knowledge, lost over the centuries, about how to unite faith and matter? But there's something the books rarely mention. The wall wasn't just a stone structure. It was also a form of symbolic resistance, a silent message to Roman power that the faith of Israel could not be destroyed. Every man who touched it, every woman who wept before it, left a part of their soul there, as if the wall were the people's last confidant. And somehow, it absorbed all of that. The tears, the cries, the prayers, everything became ingrained in the stones, and that's why it's called the Wailing Wall. Now think about it. Perhaps what keeps that wall standing isn't the architecture or the calculations, but the energy of millions of hearts that, generation after generation, believed that God still heard them through those stones. Faith, after all, is what makes the impossible bearable, and it's what transforms an ancient wall into an eternal monument. But there's a part that almost no one talks about. Under the cold light of dawn, when the place is empty, the guards say they hear footsteps coming from inside the stones. Soft sounds, as if someone were walking behind the wall, reciting prayers in a language that no longer exists. They are legends, some say. But in Jerusalem, legends often carry more truth than books. That is why the Western Wall is not just an ancient structure. It is a living testament to human resilience and divine presence. Each stone is a story, a promise, a wound, and perhaps that is why it has never fallen, because it was built upon something that not even time can destroy. Faith. Comment below. Faith also sustains me, because in the end, perhaps that wall is still standing not only because of the one who built it, but because of those who still believe that some prayers, even whispered ones, are never left unheard. If you've made it this far, perhaps you felt the same way many feel before the Wailing Wall. That silence that speaks louder than 1,000 words. Stories like this aren't just about the past. They're about our own search for meaning, faith, and courage in times that seem to be crumbling. That's why this channel exists, to remind us that the sacred still breathes in the subtext of history and that there's always something new to be discovered in the ruins of time. So if this video touched you in any way, leave a like. It's a small gesture, but it makes a huge difference in helping more people find this type of content. And if you want to continue walking with me through the forgotten mysteries of faith and humanity, subscribe to the channel. That way, every time a new story is unearthed, you'll be here to hear it first. Now tell me in the comments, write, "I'm with you until the end," just so I know you've stayed with me until now, listening to every detail, every silence, every revelation. And before you go, there's a video here that complements this topic, one that connects the past, mystery, and truth in a way that few people dare to explore. Click and stay with me there, because what comes next might forever change how you see what is eternal.